For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Shannon de Rehove. I'm at the Helen Suzman Foundation in Parktown to meet with political analyst Aubrey Machiki, who is discussing South Africa's foreign policy. How do you explain the perceived contradiction in rhetoric used by President Zuma following the passing of Resolution 1973 by the UN Security Council, which adopted to protect civilians from aggression within Libya?
We need to go back to the struggle against apartheid and the expectations that were created as a result in 1994. Because the struggle had a moral content, there was an expectation that a post-apartheid government would err on the side of human rights and the democratic imperative. So people have been complaining that it seems not only the Zuma administration, but the Mbeki administration too, has not lived up to the expectation that South Africa's foreign policy would promote democracy and a culture of human rights, not only in South Africa, but in the world. So when South Africa voted in favor of 1973, South Africa was applauded because it seemed our country was voting in favor of a resolution that was calling for the protection of civilians against an undemocratic regime. But when President Jacob Zuma started criticizing the actions of NATO, people felt the South African government was going against this democratic position and therefore going against its human rights position. Now, my view is that it's not always that simple. My view is that on balance, our foreign policy must have a record of having been on the side of human rights and democracy. But if you look at South Africa's foreign policy and her economic interests, and look at the multilateral organizations that South Africa is involved in, you will realize that there is a complex of relations that must be managed, and on the basis of which some of the decisions are made and some of the errors occur. For instance, South Africa is an African country, so there is the African Union context. South Africa is a member of IPSA. South Africa is a member of BRICS, which means it's not only continental relations that must be managed. South Africa's relations with countries such as China must be managed. And therefore, her role in the UN Security Council as a non-permanent member is sometimes very difficult to manage. Unfortunately, there is a perception that when South Africa votes against the position of the West, South Africa is taking an immoral position. And when she votes with the West, she is taking a moral position. That too is an overly simplistic approach. But I do think that in recent times, one has been unable to see what the strategic locus of our decision-making process in foreign policy is. And as a result, one thinks that maybe what is a problem with regard to how South Africa prosecutes her foreign policy is in the area of public diplomacy and communication, and therefore the failure of the South African government to communicate her positions effectively.
You say in your column that foreign policy is an extension of domestic policy. Please outline some of the multilateral factors that influence this policy, specifically South Africa's involvement in the BRICS and IBSA blocs and our relationship with China.
Well, if you look at our national challenges, we have to deal with the issues of inequality, poverty, and unemployment. Our economy on its own is not going to do that. The extent to which our economy grows and therefore gives effect to these challenges depends on our relations with countries such as China and others whose economies are growing in a context of a global economic crisis. But in the process, the attempt at giving effect to national challenges by reaching out to countries such as China may corrode our commitment to democracy and human rights. And that is why I have been arguing that what South Africa must try to do in the different multilateral contexts she operates, at times is to play a leadership role and assert her independence within that multilateral context in a manner that does not always compromise the national interest and South Africa's economic interests.
You note that South Africa's first stint in the Security Council was controversial because the voting pattern employed by the ANC-led government was seen as a betrayal of South Africa's commitment to human rights. Please provide some examples where this was the case.
Well, there are two things that Mandela highlighted in 1993, just before the advent of democracy, when he spoke about South Africa's future foreign policy. Firstly, South Africa's commitment to democracy and human rights. Secondly, the fact that South Africa would push the African agenda on the world stage. And this is what has created the expectation, as I said, that South Africa would err on the side of democracy and human rights. But if you look at how South Africa voted during her first stint in the UN Security Council on matters such as Myanmar, it seemed that we defied the expectation that would err on the side of democracy and human rights. If you look at how we voted on Libya, our position was contradictory. And that is why our government was attacked in the manner that it was. If you look at how South Africa approached the crisis in Cote d'Ivoire, there too, our position was contradictory. So on balance, it seems South Africa has not done herself any favors because the contradictions have been interpreted as a lack of commitment to democracy and human rights. But I think what is missing is not only effective communication, but the involvement of foreign policy actors outside the state, particularly civil society in South Africa. So what we need is a situation where actors external to the state are able to shape to some extent the content of South Africa's foreign policy. Because as long as we keep a distance as civil society from the foreign policy agenda and the foreign policy terrain, there is always the danger that we will be misrepresented by our government on the world stage.
How realistic is it to adapt a foreign policy that errs on the side of human rights and democracy without compromising our national and economic interests?
Well, it's not always possible to pursue a path of democracy and human rights. So I have no expectation that every time our government has to decide on a foreign policy issue, the decision will be shaped by democratic or human rights considerations. There are times when this is not possible because international relations is fraught with contradictions and double standards. Mm-hmm. And sometimes, because of those contradictions and double standards, choices will be made that are not consistent with the commitment to democracy and human rights.
Thank you very much, Aubrey.
You're welcome.
Donate now and give 15 Rand a month. SMS JOIN to 41486.